Welcome, everybody, to our guest webinar for week 8 of Surviving the Future, the Deeper Dive with Iain McGilchrist, who you'll see here among our number. And as usual, we'll start with a minute's silence. And I thought, given that it's been coming up a lot over the last week or two, and I think features very heavily in Iain's work, we might reflect on what we've given our attention to today or this week, where we place our attention. So a minute's silence. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. So in a minute, I'll open the conversation with Iain, but I'll start with a little introduction. So Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, and a literary scholar. And you can read his frankly rather impressive biography and credentials in the course materials, but suffice to say here that his thought is very much grounded in both research and practice. And he's probably best known for his revolutionary work addressing the different ways that the two hemispheres of our brain shape our conception of the world, and indeed our type and quality of attention, which he defines as the manner in which our consciousness is disposed towards whatever else exists. I think is a great definition of attention. But I would say that Iain is above all committed to the idea that the mind and the brain can only be understood in the context of the whole of our physical and spiritual existence and of the wider cultures in which they arise. And I might add that I took particular note of his work myself when last year's Deeper Dive group organised a weekly gathering called the McGilchrist Irregulars, which was organised by Bertus, who I've invited to join us for this session in deference to that fact, which in turn led me to make time for Iain's frankly astonishing books. And I think they and he carry an air of warm inquiry and deeply considered wisdom, I would say, with regard to what he would agree to be the unfolding collapse of our civilization, and in particular the reasons underpinning it and how we might live in this context. So as with Mark a few weeks ago, Iain and I decided it made sense to get straight into conversation rather than starting with a presentation from him. So I'll open with a couple of questions and then lead into yours as they emerge. As usual, if you have any questions, post them in the chat and I'll keep an eye on what's going on there and try to order and structure them in some kind of way that isn't too jumping all over the place for Iain, and also saves him from having to pay attention to the chat directly so that he can be fully in the space of the conversation. So yes, Iain, welcome. And
Thank you, Sean, and good luck with your task.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So when we spoke a couple of days ago in our prep call, you recommended this Darwin lecture that you gave a couple of weeks ago, I believe, at Cambridge, and
yes.
I've shared that in the course materials, so some of the group will have seen it. But it really struck me how, as one of the most powerful summations of all that underpins the metacrisis that I've come across yet, and it's been my focus for a couple of decades now, and so in that context, thought we might open with the question that we've been putting to all our guests, although usually towards the end of their time with us, which is why do you do what you do in that context? What's led you to the path that you walk through these times?
Yes, well, I sometimes ask myself this question, but I've always been interested in, as it were, fairly big philosophical questions. One that really concerned me when I was a teenager was this thing that seemed to me so obvious but so hard to defend, that the whole is not the same as the sum of the parts. And some of my kind of know-it-all chums would say, oh, well, then what's this special something then that you need to add in? And I myself thought, well, if you've kept your eye on the parts, it ought to be the same as the whole. But of course it isn't, because it's all in the structure and relationship, and everything exists in relationship. I've only come to realize that sort of in adulthood. but that sort of inspired me to think about a number of questions. You know, is the world really just that thing I studied in the science lessons, which seems a sort of inert mechanism, or is it something that actually is the world really sentient in all its parts? Is it speaking to me as much as I speak to it? Is there a reverberative two-way relationship between me and it? So with all this going on, and it leading me towards a spiritual, to some spiritual questions, I had intended to leave school, do theology and philosophy at Oxford, and probably go off into a monastery. I didn't do that for reasons that are, I won't go into. I'm sure it was best for me and best for the monastery. In the course of various things, I studied English. I then went on, got a fellowship at All Souls that allowed me to do lots of things, and I studied the mind-body problem, as we used to call it, and I found the philosophers just too disembodied in their approach to this. And I was inspired by Oliver Sacks. His book Awakenings came out at around this time, tells you how old I am. And I thought this is completely wonderful for a whole range of reasons. One of them is that it seems to combine somebody who really has an immense knowledge, skill, and understanding of a special area of the way we look at humans, but is able to bring it together with an enormously humane vision of what is going on for these individual humans that, in the case of Awakenings, had been struck with this encephalitis lethargica. And another thing I thought was so wonderful was the way in which he used individual cases to go deep into, not ignoring them, not turning his back on them, but going deep into them and through them to find general truths, which are often in footnotes. And I thought, this is just utterly brilliant. I want to be like this. I want to work with people. I want to understand these problems in a practical way, because they are fundamental human problems. And so at the ripe old age of 28, having got a reasonably promising academic career ahead of me, I decided to go right back to square one and go to medical school, which in this country, unlike in America, is a big step, because most people go into medical school at 18, not as in America as a second degree. So there were all these chubby young things straight out of medical school who looked at me curiously, expecting me to sort of crumble and fall apart at any moment, because I was such an extraordinary old age, about 28. And I then read medicine, which was an interesting experience, because I was married. I had two small children when I was doing house jobs that involved me working 120 hours a week. But anyway, I found this all utterly inspiring and interesting. And in the course of learning about medicine, of course, I was particularly interested in the brain. And there were one or two things that were just mentioned en passant that struck me as very interesting. That, for example, the corpus callosum, the band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, is as much involved in inhibition as it is in communication. I thought, gosh, that's fascinating. And then I began to learn about neurological diseases, and sometimes they are clearly more likely to be represented on, say, the left side of the body than the right. I thought, well, why is that? And so these questions, simmered away. And one day I heard a lecture from a totally brilliant colleague who'd spent a lot of time observing patients who'd had a stroke or an injury in either the left or the right hemisphere, and his extraordinary conclusions, which rang so many bells with me. And so effectively at this stage, having qualified as a doctor, I was training as a psychiatrist in a neuropsychiatric milieu, and I wanted to practice in that area and with a particular attention to hemisphere differences. And I have a slightly perverse streak in me, because people said to me, don't do medicine because you're going to lose your academic place in Oxford, and I did it. And then when I got into medicine and everything was looking good, they said, for heaven's sake, don't research on hemisphere differences. Nobody will take you seriously. It's all been long ago exploded as pop psychology. Nobody will take you seriously. Nonetheless, I went ahead and did it. So that's really, in a nutshell, how I ended up in this unfortunate position of believing that I've discovered something rather interesting, quite different from what most people think they know about hemisphere differences, but that seems to me to have profound significance for being a human being, which I suspect is true of all of us here today.
Somewhat. and so, as I said, having very, very much valued your Darwin lecture that I watched yesterday, you were talking for the benefit of those who haven't seen it yet, about this, the metacrisis, the climacteric, as my late mentor David Fleming calls it, and talking about its roots in the kind of increasing dominance of left hemispheric thinking and engagement and attention over the right, and to my eyes make a very compelling case for that. And I wonder in what ways, like obviously a lot of people have talked about the increasing growth of proceduralization, for example, and power hungriness over things like service and truth and beauty and goodness. And in what ways do you find it helpful or useful to view those kind of social and philosophical problems through the lens of hemispheric difference? Like how is there a difference in how you would approach those sort of recognized problems using this particular lens?
I think there is. I think it helps us to see both why we've ended up in the pickle that we were in and what we would need to do. I say this rather cautiously, what we would need to do to help move away from the crisis that is looming. I say it rather cautiously because exactly what I mean here is that I'm not talking about mechanisms. When we look at most things, including, of course, amazingly relevantly for me all my life has been the body as a mechanism. We see everything basically by analogy with the machine model, the world as a machine. And if a machine is going wrong, there's a part that needs fixing. But this is not something where a part either went wrong or can be fixed. I mean, there are things we can do at the practical level. I entirely accept that. And of course, they're important. But what I'm really saying is that it will never be enough to just look at things from that low level of cause and effect. It wasn't just an odd bad decision we made. Everything was going very well, and then suddenly somebody pointed to the weather changing, and somebody said that, oh gosh, we've discovered that there's a lot of plastic in the oceans and so on. Oh, and then all these things, they didn't sort of just come at random as like pieces of bad luck. They are the entirely predictable consequences of a certain way of being in the world. And so if we're to understand it, we need to think about what that way of being is and set about substituting a more wholesome, a healthier, a more profound, a more moral, a more spiritually enriching way of being in the world. So, there are different levels at which you can answer a question. There's the sort of one that we normally go to, which is, well, let's restructure the economy in this way. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what I'm pointing to is that it is a spiritual malaise, and that if it is to be cured, it can't be cured by purely material means.
Yeah, again, my late mentor David used to talk about the 5 whys. Why has this happened, and then why, and then why, and why, and a bit like the kind of children's game. But he said it does have this disconcerting habit of eventually leading back to you.
Well, I like that because I think it does lead back to us, and it does point to us as the starting point for change, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah. I mean, so maybe one other thing, in sort of contextualizing our conversation for those who maybe don't know your work so well and maybe haven't seen the lecture, is a question that you addressed, at least in brief, in that, coming from sort of Kelly and Alberto here, what factors drive or have driven this emergence of the dominance of the left hemisphere, the more narrowly focused, proceduralized hemisphere? And Kelly speculates, do you think there could be any connection between the fact that our industrial society separates us from direct contact with or reliance on our environment, and this rise of left brain dominance?
Very good questions. In the lecture, if you are able to spare the time to watch it, I do point to 7 possible causes for this inevitable drift towards the left hemisphere's outlook. I say inevitable because in an earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, I say earlier because I'm mainly interested in my more recent book, The Matter with Things, at the moment. But in the book for which I suppose I first became known, The Master and His Emissary, I look at the history of the West, looking at the various key moments, turning points in the history of ideas. And I see them through the lens of whether they lead us to a more balanced view of the best of what the left hemisphere can offer and the right hemisphere can offer, or whether they skew the way in which we think more towards exclusively one way of looking at the world. And I come to the conclusion that 3 times in the history of the West since the ancient Greeks, there has been a sudden emergence of a wonderfully flourishing civilization in which the best of the left and right contributed together. And then this lasted for a few hundred years. And in each case, it began to decay as it moved more and more to the point of view of the left hemisphere. Now, I realize there may be some people here who don't know what I mean by points of view of the right and left hemisphere, but unless you particularly want me to do, it could take me about 10 minutes to go through it all, and for most people it'd probably be rather dull. But if you want me to do, I will do it. But it is one towards a more sclerotic, a more hierarchical, a more linearly organized, bureaucratically dominated way of holding life together for the people that are in that civilization. So early on, you see enormous flexibility, you see humanity, as it were, in the sense of, the truly humane in that society. And you see the arts flourishing, you see the beginnings of science flourishing, and you see, again, humane lawmaking and so on. But as each civilization, to some extent, overreaches itself, it needs to, as we now say in that ghastly phrase, roll out some procedural way of doing things across a great geological, geographical, I should say, expanse, but also, of course, that geography brings with it differences of history and differences of culture and differences of climate and so on. So these are very, very rough things that get imposed across the field. And I mean, if you look around the world now, there is one way of thinking, which is now basically the American capitalist way of thinking, which is being imposed all around the world. As, it's being imposed a lot by media, by propaganda, to some extent by diplomacy, and if all else fails, by war. And I'm sorry, this may sound rather anti-American. I don't wish it to be at all. America just happens to be in the position of being the most powerful dominion on earth at the moment. And I think that what happens is that a lot of things begin to take over. One is the left hemisphere, which controls your right hand with which you do the grabbing, and the left hemisphere, which developed in order to make us efficient at manipulating and grabbing, becomes rather successful at getting stuff. And so civilizations rather like this. We become more and more rich in the means to fulfill our ends, but become less and less wise about what our ends should be. And there are a lot of other things. It's a much easier, when civilization loses contact with the intuitive level at which we understand things, through contact with nature, through the continuum of a living tradition, when we turn our backs on these things, then everything has to be put together anew by a kind of logical discourse. Let's start from scratch. And our theories are never as rich as the vast body of experience gained at great cost by our ancestors and handed to us. And tradition just means handing down something to you. And it doesn't mean sclerosis. It means the opposite of sclerosis. You can only really change if you're in a flowing tradition, which is like a river. It's never the same. It's always moving. But if you cut off the tradition and try to rethink everything from scratch, you come up with the most ridiculous, inhuman, barren, conceptual schema of what life would be like, something like a computer would come up with. So these are the sort of things that happen. And I like the fact that somebody pointed out the distinction, the way in which one of the important points at the moment is that we're alienated from nature. I mean, the two other things that are extremely important for human flourishing, apart from proximity to nature and immersion in nature and the natural world and the natural order, which should be intuitively part of our lives. The other two things are belonging to a coherent culture in which you share beliefs and you can trust to share your life. And the third is having some sort of center in whatever you like to call it, but let's call it the spiritual realm. And it may or may not be a religion, but at least in the sense of there being a higher power, which is greater and more profound than we can conceive. Now, those three things, it's not just my opinion, but that's massively backed by evidence, and a lot of it's in the matter with things. These things are now incontrovertibly the most important things for human flourishing. And, you know, if you wanted to make a people completely miserable, you try and destroy each of these three things, and that's exactly what we're doing now.
And I mean, that ties in beautifully with, well, firstly, I want to pass on that Anne in Carolina said, don't worry, we feel the same way about the United States as well. So you've not caused any offense there, and a lot of love for that comment. But Don was asking, so to what extent do you feel that growing up in a culture like the dominant one today kind of fixes in a hemispheric dominance, or is that something we can change as individuals? Is that something that has to be changed culturally? Or Alan was asking, you know, is it something maybe we can do by creating spaces at the margins of the dominant system where we eschew some of that proceduralization and adopt more right-brained approaches?
Yes, I resonate with all those remarks. I think that obviously to an extent we are schooled, if you like, in a certain way of thinking about the world, which is rooted in a viewpoint of too great detachment. There is something very important in being able to detach yourself from the immediate, and it's one of the great achievements of the human brain and mind is to be able to stand back from experience. And this is not a bad thing. Animals tend to find it very difficult to do so. So if they sense aggression, they simply respond with aggression, and bites lead to bites. But a human being can say, well, maybe this person actually is feeling rather threatened. Maybe I can make an ally out of them. Maybe I can heal this. All this kind of thinking requires standing back from the immediacy of the world. But if you stand back too far, then you become objective in a cold, detached way, which leads to manipulation. So you don't want to be either completely fused with reality or so far removed from it as to be outside of it completely. This is why I dislike the word environment for nature. I call it nature, which literally means something in the process of being born. Whereas the environment is just something around us, but it isn't. It's inside us and we are in it. So sorry, that's a long way round of saying that we are schooled in a way of thinking in which we are somewhat, perhaps too removed from the world, and see it as something we can utilize, whereas not enough attention is paid to how we should respect, be grateful for, be humble towards, be to an extent open to the wonder of existence. These things are now not prioritized. In fact, they are probably somewhat despised by much of the mainstream culture. But they are of incalculable importance, and they're certainly important to each individual life. But I think they're also important for the recovery of the life of a society. So it's partly that, but it's not to say that we can't change. We can change. That was another question. So are we sort of stuck with what we've been given? And the answer to that is definitely not. Part of this is we can change our practices. We can change the way we actually live from day to day. We can also become more aware of things that we've driven out of our lives and been encouraged to drive out of our lives. And once we're aware of them, it may not be that difficult actually to find them again. A lot of the problem is blindness. And a lot of what I believe I have done, if I've done anything in writing these books, and people write to me to tell me all the time, thank goodness, and thank them for their generosity in doing so, because I need to hear it, that, you know, that I've opened eyes, that they see things differently. And once they've seen them, they can't unsee them again. That it's changed the way in which they see and think. Now, if that's true, that is a sign of hope. And the person who said, can we do something on the margins, I think is also very good. I'm now finding that whether we like it or not, a lot of the creative stuff is being driven out towards the margins. So, for example, to my great sadness, the great universities, I can really only know the ones in this country, but, you know, I myself was a student at Oxford, and I was then a fellow of an Oxford college. I've always thought these 1,000-year-old institutions, Oxford and Cambridge and others like it, are very important. But at the moment, I think they've missed their way. They're becoming irrelevant because they're becoming hidebound by various dogmas, and they're taking on board ill-thought-through doctrines. And as a result, a lot of the original thinking is actually going on in smaller outfits, both in science and in the humanities, often not in Anglophone countries, and often by groups of people working together in original ways. Now, this is a sign of hope to me, even though the fact that we can't replace those wonderful institutions. I mean, can we save them in time? I don't know. I mean, as well as giving that talk at Cambridge, I gave a talk at Oxford the previous 3 days before, actually, in which I was saying, you know, we've given up on truth. If we give up on truth, there is no point in a university. We might as well all pack up and go home. If it's just about pleasing ourselves and playing around with ideas, but if there is no idea that, not that there's one single simple truth, good heavens, I've lived long enough to know that that's not the case, but I also know that none of us could possibly think or act or have any reason for doing so unless there was some truth. We wouldn't be bothered to get out of bed in the morning if we didn't believe that some things are truer than others. But I now find that in the humanities, now for probably about 70 years, but in science, very, very worryingly in the last 10 years, people are imposing a kind of censorship on what can be said and what can be explored and so on. And once you go there, then really we have nothing left to rely on. Because although science can't tell us the answers to all our problems, I'm a great exponent of the fact that science is limited. But in the areas that it can tell us what it can find, it is irreplaceable. Its findings are gold dust. And we need that along with imagination and intuition. You know, in the second part of the matter of things, where I talk about how do we get to know anything, I say, well, effectively, I believe that we probably all agree that there's science and there's reason, but as well as that, there is intuition and there is imagination, and that actually the other two, the first two, are not any good without intuition and imagination. And I can demonstrate that all the great discoveries in science and mathematics were made with intuition and imagination as part a very important part, perhaps the definitive part in the picture of what was created.
I feel like breaking into a round of applause, Iain, but thank you. I'm unfortunately being out in the boondocks here in Ireland. I haven't heard about. Presumably, Oxford University has packed up and gone home a few weeks ago, and I might have missed the news. But
no, I don't think that it was that effective, and I would be very sad if it did. But I wanted to sound a note of warning, you know. And a very dear and esteemed colleague of mine said, well, you could have been a little bit more positive. But I thought sometimes it's very, I mean, I'm a great one for being positive, and I hope we can talk about, you know, what can be done, not just packing up and going home. But I think there are times when you have to speak truth to power. You know, you have to say, I'm sorry, it's not good enough what you're doing at the moment. You're betraying the young, and you're betraying our civilization.
Amen. So a quick question from Alan, who was the one who asked about maybe building alternative, more right hemisphere functions on the margins. He was asking if there are any particular places you recommend for accessing that kind of original thinking that you refer to outside the Anglophone world and at smaller institutions. Like, is there anything you'd point to in that regard?
I'm sorry, there isn't, frustratingly. I can't say, you know, will this place, although the next place I'm going to be speaking, and that will be in, crikey, less than 2 weeks, is at Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia, which I think is a wonderful institution. It's only a year or two old, but it is brought into existence by a very cited and wise man, Stephen Blackwood, who was basically responding to the idea that we have stopped passing on, you know, the values of the classical tradition. Now, this is not to say that the classical tradition is the only tradition or that it has all the wisdom in the world, but it is very important that it isn't lost. And so I think they're very open-minded. There is no particular religious or political affiliation, but they are really, I mean, their motto, I think, is basically thinking makes us free. And so that would be just an example off the top of my head. But very often when I read really interesting pieces of research, and so on, I find that they're from institutions in, it would be invidious to say where exactly, because that makes it sound like I think those places are boondocks, but they're not. But if you know what I mean, they're not necessarily the mainstream American and English institutions, or even the mainstream German and French institutions or whatever, but in other places where people are more able to think freely, actually, curiously. So there we are. I think that what we need to be doing, though, is just, it's quite simple. We need to be adopting a more grown-up attitude to people we disagree with. I mean, there's one so obvious thing wrong with the world, is that it's no longer possible to say, well, you know, Voltaire famously said, you know, I disagree with everything you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And we're not even talking about things that are, you know, horrible by any definition and should probably never be uttered in public. But we're just talking about, if you disagree with somebody, whatever happened to common courtesy and to common sense? We don't, each of us, know everything. We know very little. Humanity knows very little, but each of us knows very little. And if somebody wants to disagree with me, I'm very happy to say, well, that's very interesting. Tell me more about why you disagree. And I'll say, yeah, I get that. But, you know, when I think like that, I always come to the idea that X, you know, and then, what did you do when you think like that? Then we have a conversation. Then some truth will come out of it. But if you just cut off conversations and no platform people and refuse to promote them and refuse to publish them, this is just childish. And I really mean it's childish, because when you're young and you don't know a lot, you're very dogmatic and you're absolutely emphatic that you know what you're talking about. But, you know, unfortunately, we live in a culture where probably it's not good to defer only to elders, but a little bit of listening to elders is good, as long as we're listening with the young, listening to the young. It's a combination. And I quote from actually Solzhenitsyn's book, August 1914, though in the lecture I think I misattribute it to his Harvard speech, that intolerance is a sign of a poor education. It's a universal law. Now, if we were actually educating people to be intolerant at our best institutions, we've gone wrong.
And I just want to check in, Ian, about this format. Is this working for you? Is this feeling?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, my time is for you to do whatever you want with. If it's not working for you, you tell me.
No, it's wonderful. It really is. I just wanted to check in. Okay, so I think in your last two questions, you've kind of prompted something. So a couple of weeks ago, one of our guests was Lila June Johnston, who comes from an indigenous North American culture, the Dene people, and you were just talking about how the classical culture is by no means the only one or the only valid one, and in your lecture you talked about how you've looked at the sort of history of the West and how you've seen this kind of flourishing of these great periods where the right and left hemisphere seem to be working together and working appropriately. And then this kind of decline into this left hemispheric kind of focus. And I think you quoted the examples, ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, and I think the modern world. And of course, all of those only go back about, the earliest of those only goes back about 2,500 years into the 200,000 or 300,000 year history of Homo sapiens. And I'm very interested in how a lot of older cultures, indigenous cultures, have this concept of vertigo or vendigo, this kind of cultural sickness that's come upon. Oh, have I lost my internet? I think everyone's frozen.
Don't know. I can hear you.
You're still okay, Sean.
That's not good.
No, you're okay. I think you have frozen a bit.
Yeah,
no, there you
are. Did I freeze? Yeah, I'm back. I think everyone else froze, so I assumed I lost my connection. But yeah, so I hope you heard most of what I was saying. That older kind of indigenous cultures have this concept of vertigo or vendigo, this kind of cultural sickness that we represent. The cultures we were born into have this kind of very individual focused. Really resonated for me a lot with what you're talking about of the left hemisphere. And so, yeah, do you see examples to emulate maybe in older cultures?
Oh, absolutely. Of course I do. I hope I didn't give an impression that I didn't. In fact, since as long as I can remember, going back to my late teens, I was fascinated by Eastern cultures, Chinese, Japanese, Indian. And as I have learnt more, I've learnt a great deal about indigenous cultures in other parts of the world. And as you know, in part 3 of The Matter with Things, I begin with relating one of the most extraordinary myths, which shows remarkable insight into the human condition. And it's an old Onondaga myth. And the Onondaga people are part of the Iroquois nation. And there's enormous wisdom in it. And we could learn so much from other cultures and what they see. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to say is that we need to see as many different points of view as possible. But I don't think the outcome of that will be vilifying Western civilization, except vilifying the sickness that it has now developed. I think where we are now is sick. I think we're all sickening from this. And one of the pieces of evidence is the vast increase in mental illness, particularly in the last 30 years. Compared with 100 years ago, we are so much sicker than we were. So it is a rather recent phenomenon, but it could also be said that it goes back a couple of thousand years. In the very opening words of the matter of things. I say, I want to champion a point of view that has been systematically denied in the West for the last 300 years, and some people would say for the last 2,000 years. So I'm aware that the point of view I am promoting is one that you can find in history of the West, but it's not the mainstream position. But I wouldn't want to, perhaps I'm being confusing, but I wouldn't want to rule out anything here. I think there are values in, you see, when I was young, I used to be very critical of the West, and was very critical of the West compared with the East until recently. And two things have happened. One is the East has completely lost its plot, at least China has. And Japan and India and other places in the East may be doing better than China, but China has become a parody of all the worst things that are left hemispheric: totalitarian control, and all the rest. So I've fallen out of love slightly with that, but that's only superficial. The other thing that's happened is that there's become a trend for constantly vilifying the West. And so I'm the person who is always the skeptic amongst believers and the believer amongst skeptics. I'm constantly putting the other point of view from the one that is being currently imposed on us. So when people start doing that, I suddenly start thinking, well, hang on a moment. The West has given us so much that is so valuable. It's like that thing in the life of Brian. Well, what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, okay, yes, well, health and plumbing and, all that. So, I mean, we have actually, we shouldn't be vilifying our history in this way. We should be saying, of course, we can see it through a different lens, and there are things that need to be stressed differently as we evolve as a culture. And we can learn from other cultures, including from ones that have lasted a very long time. But mind you, much as I don't want to say anything critical about indigenous cultures, there's just two comments I would make, is that people who really know them quite well quite often point out that there are aspects of those cultures that are not the kinds of thing that we would particularly condone, admire, or really feel good about. So they're not examples of some kind of perfection. That's the kind of noble savage idea, which, and the other thing is that it is wonderful that such cultures have persisted, and God forbid that we should be the reason why they should ever cease to be, because, as I say, they're beautiful and important in their own right. They deserve to survive, and we deserve to learn from them. But there is a distinction, I would say, between such a culture and the sorts of things that a civilization that can produce Bach or Michelangelo or whatever it is can produce. And you may well say, yes, they're produced at a cost, and I would agree with you. But there's always good and bad. We live in a terribly simplistic world in which it's either this or it's that, and either this is bad or it's good. Very often, many of the things that we think are so marvelously good, if we looked at them a little bit more carefully, we'd see that there's a hidden bad that's going to creep up and bite us in the bum. And equally, there are things that we think are terrible that have neglected good in them that we're missing. So, sorry to be always the guy who's arguing the other point of view, but that is really what keeps me going intellectually, is seeing a lot of different things and trying to bring them together into a statement which is still coherent, rather than just going, oh, well, choose what you like, guys. I've got nothing to say. As you can see, for somebody who values silence and non-saying and non-doing, I spend far too much of my time talking.
Well, yeah, I have something of the contrarian in me too, because as you say, that's how we learn. If we all just sit around agreeing with each other, then we don't really get anywhere.
It's boring.
And so I guess even widen it a bit further. So I sort of bringing in, more diverse human cultures there. And I wonder what happens if we step into non-human cultures. We've been talking a bit about if economics is the ways that we feed ourselves and clothe ourselves and meet our needs. Of course, all the non-humans on the planet, all the other Earthlings do those things too. who was it? Name's gone out of my head right now, but someone just defined biology as the study of animal economics, which I rather like. And given that, and given by Matty's question in the chat, the growing appreciation for forests and trees and non-animals as conscious living systems,
Absolutely.
presumably don't share the hemispheric distinction that animals do. But you know, what can we learn from the ways in which those cultures, those economies function, especially given that all human economies are really just playing with the surplus that other natural economies produce?
Well, these are deep questions. So the first thing is that I believe that we're only beginning to scrape the surface of our understanding of what it is that animals know and understand. I mean, of course, there are things that we know and understand that they don't, but I think there are things they know and understand that we don't. I was constantly amazed in researching for that book, which took a very long time, The Matter with Things. The extent, the constant surprise of understanding things that animals are capable of. And so there's a great, great well of wonderful, flourishing life there. And I, of course, extend it further to plants and to trees. And I suggest in my chapter on consciousness and matter that consciousness is absolutely not confined to, not only not confined to humans, but not confined to the animal world, but also is present in plants and trees that, as we all know now, can share resources, thinking of your animal economics, and so forth. But of course, it's all part of an even bigger vision, which is that all things in the cosmos are, to some extent, partaking in the ground of being. I mean, I'm going to go off into the outer reaches here, but that I'm a believer in a sort of panpsychism. I'm a believer in something called panentheism, which believes, not like pantheism, that God is just the sum of all things, but that God is more than the sum of all things. All things are in God, but do not exhaust God. And God is in all things, but God is not summed up by his being in all things. So to that extent, I see the whole of creation as Blake would have said, as holy. And that our sacrilegious way of treating it as mere stuff for us to manipulate is, well, it is a crime, is a moral turpitude, and is a spiritual desecration. So, yes, I mean, you're preaching to the converted, whoever it is who is talking about, you know, should we not be also respecting the forests and so on? Of course, absolutely, we should. And I live where I do because I live in a place where I'm very close to elemental nature, and I find it necessary, really. I can't imagine any longer living in a town.
Well, if we're getting out there, as you say, which is something we like to do in this group, I think this might be a good moment to bring in David Baum and his question. If you'd like to unmute David, he's going to speak it himself. That's his preference.
Okay.
Hello, sir. It's an incredible honor to speak with you, and I thank you and congratulate you for your work on behalf of all humankind. It's really marvelous, and I thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a member of the McGilchrist Irregulars with Bertus and Jeff, and when we were meeting, I used to regale them with a particular interpretation of your work regarding cosmology and the ground of being. And I wonder if you could say if it strikes you as plausible. I've timed this question. It is about 1 minute long. I will get to the end. I propose that you have seen not just differing functions of two neuronal masses, but two fundamental principles of the universe, two kinds of mind with the characteristics of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. You quote Blake on this: energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. That's the quote. Do you think it's plausible that what pours forth from the ground of being are two forces, two principles or influences, like yin and yang, but not symmetrical in the perfect balance of the circle of the Tao, but rather asymmetrical? On the one hand, the living, flowing power of life, which encounters the restriction and resistance of order, form, and logos, and that this is the fundamental process by which the universe is manifested. Does that strike you as plausible, sir?
Well, thank you. A great question. The short answer is I think it is highly plausible. I do think that at all levels, somehow in the cosmos, there needs to be a tension between two principles that may appear opposed to our left hemisphere, but are actually in a kind of harmonic relation out of which everything emerges, as would be seen by our right hemisphere. So I think that these principles are asymmetrical, as the brain hemisphere is very symmetrical in all respects, including in their importance and their insight, but also anatomically and physiologically and so forth. So I think asymmetry is at the core. And it's also present in that Iroquois legend that I mentioned, because after all, whoever wrote it wasn't able to, to measure anything to do with the brain, but was seeing something that is at the core, at least, of our experience of the cosmos. And of course, the difficulty is we can't know whether the cosmos looks the way it is because our brains make it apparent to us in that way, or whether it's the other way around, that our brains are so structured because the cosmos they're in communion with is so structured. And I said that to Rowan Williams one day, and you know, Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, and is a great theologian. And he said, but does it have to be either? And I think he's completely right. It doesn't have to be either of those. In fact, that question is the wrong question. I think that our minds come into being as a kind of mirror of what it is that is, and it is its way of understanding itself. So I see, maybe I'm going too far here from your question, but I see the cosmos as a constantly creative unfolding of an infinite potential, and that it is, as it were, learning its own potential through the process of unfolding it. So that, as it were, there's a two-way process, and obviously, again, it's not a symmetrical one, between the creative principle and whatever it is that is actualized and created, but that each plays a role and answers to the other. So yes, I do think, in sum, that you've put your finger on something that I think I hint at it pretty strongly. I also hinted at it at the end of The Master and His Emissary, where I referred to Milton in Paradise Lost with the, you know, after all, Lucifer, who became the force for evil, was originally the brightest angel, hence the name. And so this falling away of something which has its purpose, but it, nonetheless, it takes its power to itself. And by doing so, somehow upsets the balance or the harmony of the creation. I think that is at the core. And you can be sure that Milton wasn't talking about hemispheres either, but he intuited something there that is reflected in the structure of the hemispheres. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Do you want to follow up on that at all, David, or is that good?
I would love to, but I'm not sure now is the time. Thank you. I'll just Thank you so much for the time, sir. Good day.
Thank you very much.
And Bertus, do you want to come in?
Well, yes, I would certainly. I probably would need like 4 hours conversation to address everything I wanna ask. But
Sure.
I'll keep it simple. I think I want to take it away a bit from the deep philosophical and make it more personal. When I came across your book, it was a very personal encounter, like emotional even, because it was the first time, and there was the master and his emissary, first time that I heard somebody voice what I had been thinking like all my life, feeling all my life. And I want to ask about that because I never hear it addressed like directly, and I wonder about it. For me, it feels like I'm sort of have a natural inclination for very right hemispheric approach to the world. I'm sort of very much to the right, I think, naturally. This would mean that there are also like left hemispheric natural inclined people walking around, and people in the middle. Like there's a whole spectrum. And I feel a bit that you mostly talk about a sort of ideal middle being that is very much in balance with a bit to the right, with a bit leaning over to the right. But I want to ask, like straightforwardly, am I right in assuming that there are right hemispheric people and left hemispheric people, and people in the middle? Is that a good assumption or not?
Well, it inevitably involves simplifications. And so there are some ways in which somebody might espouse a very left hemispheric take, but they might in other ways espouse something quite different. So, well, I mean, an example might be somebody who was by profession an engineer and was attracted very much to a mechanical model from which they were able to deduce things that are very useful. And they may spend a lot of their time reveling in that kind of a world, but they may have other things that fascinate them. And I know this is true because so many of such people write to me. So they say, I'm the sort of person who always considered myself what you would call rather left hemispheric. But I thank you for writing, because I now realize that it's okay for other parts of things that I do feel and I'm aware of. And I also understand better what other people have meant all my life when they've said, what about so-and-so? And I haven't really been able to contact it. So I think it's complicated. I would slightly resist the idea that there are simply left and right hemispheric people. But I think we're all inclined more or less to certain ways of thinking. Most of us a bit of a mix, I would imagine. But what you really touched on there that I think is so nice is that you'd sort of, as it were, known it all along. And that is something that it's another common theme when people write to me, is somehow you gave me a way to articulate something I've never been able to articulate, but have known all my life. And you gave me words and you gave me confidence. Now, if that's all I do, then I'm happy. That's good enough for me. And the evidence is that is what happens. And it also is very reassuring because, you know, in the matter with things, I start from neurology and I move to philosophy and I end up by bringing in some physics in a sort of very low level way because I'm not a physicist. But what I'm trying to say is that starting from these different standpoints of looking at the world, what do we know from physics? What do we know from our philosophizing? What do we know from neuropsychology? We come in the end, like starting from the outer points of a sphere, we come into the center and find we've come to the same core. So they agree. And what's even better is that what they agree on is the sort of thing that people have been saying in other cultures and in part in the West for a couple of thousand years or more. And when you couple all four of those strands with the fifth strand, which is people writing in and saying, actually, I understood this intuitively all my life, then I think I'm probably onto something here. Thank you very much. I wish we had time to explore the other 4,000 hours, but I don't think we do.
Okay, Cassidy, I assume maybe you want to ask the most recent question you posted, which I was about to put to Iain, so maybe you want to do so yourself.
Sure. Hi, Iain. My name is Cassidy.
Hi.
I tried to have you write an essay about some of this stuff for New York Times Opinion a couple of years ago. I think you were traveling in Australia.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Oh, lovely to meet you at last.
It's lovely to meet you. My question is about if you might be willing to share whether you've had a personal experience of the divine and how that has influenced your work, because I assume that you would not be able to get where you are without direct experience, but we would all love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes. Thank you. Good question, difficult one, really. Because I think my answer is, in one sense, absolutely yes, and in another, no. So I haven't had a sort of vision or an angel appearing to me. Although I might backtrack slightly on that. That might be one thing that I have experienced. But mainly it is that coming with no preconceptions, because my father thought things religious were rather funny, really, and completely absurd. And my mother was agnostic, but I was not I was never taken to church or anything like that. But in my teens, I discovered religious music. I discovered the beauty of parts of the liturgy and the King James Bible. And so these things spoke to me of something absolutely beyond and absolutely incontrovertibly spiritual. I still think that if you listen to certain kinds of very beautiful music, it's not enough to say it's beautiful. It's not enough to say that it's beautifully structured or something like that. It is actually speaking to some other part of you, which is your soul. And I find that nature does that too. So, I see nature as so much more than what meets the eye, if you see what I mean. I think of Blake again, who sort of says that, to a certain way of looking, a tree is just a green thing that stands in the way. To another person, it's an insight into eternity. And so I think these are the things I would point to, really. And I think they've become so much part of the fabric of things that I don't really need another worldly experience. I have this slightly frustrating thing that people have said, you should try various drugs. And I'm afraid as a young man, I was terribly boring. I mean, I did smoke a bit. And I once or twice was in a room where people were smoking marijuana, so I did. And it had no effect on me at all. And after trying half a dozen times, I gave up. And I won't go into it all, but since then, and since publishing things and becoming better known, people have taken me aside and said, try a bit of this. And it's not, whatever it has never had any effect on me. And one way I look at it is, well, look, it wouldn't have done you... It wouldn't have cost you anything just to declare yourself in a moment when I'm taking LSD or something. But the other way of looking at it is, whatever it is declaring itself to me all the time. So I don't really need that. It's in the air I breathe. That's the only way I can put it.
Thank you.
I'd still love to write something for the New York Times. I'm just, at the moment, too busy lecturing. But I haven't forgotten. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess on a related note, Leander was asking about the kinds of mind that exist in other parts of the body than the brain. The knowledge present in our guts and in our hands and literally in our hearts. And Greg, sort of putting that in different language, was asking about how might the solar plexus, the brachial plexus, operate as additional centers of mindedness, and what are their specialities, and whether that offers any possibilities for choosing to engage with these different minds and their strengths.
Well, yes, and I mean, of course, in Chinese and Indian culture, I mean, maybe in many others, but those are the ones I know about. There are um, centers of consciousness that are elsewhere in the body. I think mainly down the midline of the body, but nonetheless, there they are. And it's absolutely true that, for example, the human gut has more neurons in it than the brain of a dog, which is a highly intelligent animal. So that's pretty interesting. They're not all, you can bet your bottom dollar, they're not all involved in peristalsis. So they're doing something. And as I sometimes mention, when I was at medical school, we were taught that there were efferent fibers, that's to say nerves traveling outwards from the brain to the heart, giving it messages, and of course to the gut. But there were also quite a lot of fibers running back the other way. This was a bit of an embarrassment. What were they there for? And I thought, well, this is really interesting. Maybe they're telling the brain something it doesn't know. You know, this could be important. So I do very much believe that we do have centers of intelligence in our body, really a unified intelligence, which is, it's not all in the brain, of course, but a lot of it becomes ultimately mediated through the pathways of the brain. And so in as much as there are obvious neuronal correlates of our thinking, it's easier to think of them in the brain, with its constantly being in dialogue with other parts of the body, such as the gut and the heart and so forth. And you know, I like the idea that the hands have their own intelligence, which they certainly do. And if you start to think too much about what you're doing with your hands, you'll make mistakes. So they very much depend on not being thought about. You know, if the thinking mind, the old left hemisphere comes, oh, well, let's have a look at this. It's no good. It won't work anymore. So being outside the spotlight is very important. And of course, you know, our unconscious mind is much bigger than we think. It's not just a sort of add-on to consciousness that's sort of down there in the cellar. It's almost all of everything that we know. Is in the unconscious realm. Somebody suggested that 99.44% of all that we know is in the unconscious realm, and you don't have to buy the accuracy to get the general idea that very little of what we know is fully conscious to us, but we nonetheless are able to draw on it, which is why it's so very important that we don't give in to the constant barrage of people telling us that our intuitions are mistaken. Of course, an intuition can be mistaken. So can reason be mistaken. As I sometimes point out, you know, people with schizophrenia, the trouble with them is that they've lost everything but reason, as G.K. Chesterton pointed out. So they arrive at what are to them rational conclusions about what's going on, but just deduced from extremely odd bases, which common sense would have told them, no, there isn't the little man living in the socket on the wall. It's probably more likely in your head. So, so rationalizing about things can lead to errors. Intuiting can lead to errors, but intuition can bring together a lot of knowledge from a whole range of sources, some of which apparently superficially contradict one another, but all of which need to be taken into account.
Gary, you wanted to ask a question around technology and spirit.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Dr. McGilchrist. Yeah, it's been great to listen. So my question, I'm going to be seeing a film this week called Atomic Hope, and it's being put on by the proponents of using certain kinds of nuclear power plants as our kind of new green energy. I think Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Dick Cheney, and others have been been proponents of this. My sense is, when we're thinking about left and right brain, that this is the kind of thinking that is doubling down on the thinking that got us into the predicament rather than stepping back. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on technology, because we need to use some technology, but how do we hold that, you know, that kind of, you know, as we move forward? It's
Yeah.
it's a little
Yes.
scary. And what's mostly driving it too is this need to sort of mass produce in this project. They want to mass produce some nuclear power plants because it's cheaper.
Yes.
You make money that
Yes.
way too. Any thoughts?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm wary of talking about things that I don't know a lot about, and I'm not an expert on the wicked problems of energy. What I think I can say is that, as far as I'm aware, there's no one way of creating energy that has no drawbacks to it. Ideally, we'd be tapping the source of energy which is under our feet, so geothermal energy. If we found a way of doing that practically, and I gather it's simply not practical at the moment, that would be a very fine thing. But I suspect that all ways of producing energy have their costs and benefits. But I think what you're drawing attention to is that what got us into this in the first place is the idea that we need to depend on machines. And now we've come to a point where we can't not depend on them for a whole host of reasons. One is, as you say, that some of the problems that we've got ourselves into are so technical that we will need machine help to get out of them. And the other is that we have systematically de-skilled ourselves and blunted our senses, blunted our intuitions, made ourselves literally stupider than our ancestors were by relying on machines to the extent that we have. So that if machines go down, we're more or less hopeless. I mean, we're like a newborn infant. We have no way of sustaining ourselves. So we've got ourselves into a mess, and to get out of it, we may still need some technology. But surely, for there to be a future, we have to become much less reliant on technology to do our work. One of the things is that, work is seen as something bad, but even those of us who have a love-hate relationship with work know that work can also be very fulfilling. And indeed, for many people, their work is their life. And when they give up working, they often quite quickly die. And we also know that people who have no work, but who would will to have work, are prone to misery and depression. So I think that work, our aversion from work is a very bad thing. And I'm not holding myself up here as any kind of, paragon. I'm not. Like everyone else, I love the fact that I can rely on machines to do things. But I think that there lies the problem. And in doing it, we also move ourselves just away from the immediacy of contact with the material world. The more we rely on machines, the less we're actually simply touching things, feeling the breath of the outside air on us, looking at things, smelling things, being with things. There's certain kinds of work where one works with one's hands and with one's whole body, which I think is particularly fulfilling, probably. But the more we work in this way, the more we cut ourselves off from things. And I know that I've done it myself, partly because my work is so involved with reading and writing and thinking. But a lot of thinking goes on in the interstices, and that's when I'm able to walk or do whatever I want. Sorry, I didn't answer that question at all well, but those are my sort of reflections. I wish we could find a sort of energy that was not damaging.
Well, it strikes me in that this ties into something we touched on a couple of days ago when we spoke briefly, and it was one of those things where we both agreed not to talk about it because otherwise we wouldn't be able to talk about it fresh now. So I'm quite keen to hear what you think.
Okay.
I mentioned my friend Mark here, who for much that reason has given up on electricity, and who we met on this course about a month ago. And one of the things that he really focuses on is how the dominant culture is so obsessed with comfort and how can we make ourselves more comfortable. And he doesn't ask himself, how can I make myself more comfortable? He asks himself, what would make me feel more alive, or what might be the more beautiful path?
Yes.
And I know you said you'd love for me to come back to that question here.
Yes.
So now.
Well, I think so. Yes. Because it immediately takes us to the important question, which surely in the next quarter of an hour I can answer. Which is what is life and what is it for? You know, what are we doing here? Now, that seems to me our main predicament. And in the previous conversation, we were talking about people who believe that the importance is to be making money, therefore to have influence and power. But I think this is only to see the very limited values of the left hemisphere, which it is in service of one value, which is utilization and the acquisition of power. But I won't go into it here, but you all know probably if you've looked at either of my books, because I quoted in both, Max Shaler's Hierarchy of Values, in which it is simply at the lowest level, that value. And I think we've lost sight of the higher values of at least goodness, beauty, and truth. And I think also of the sacred, whatever we mean by that. And it's not puttable into words. I spent 118 pages saying this is not something you can put into words, but hoping that by my not saying it, I was bringing about an image of it, much in the way that when you're trying to produce an area of light in a painting, you have to paint everything else dark in order that the light can show. So, yes, and so the question arises, what is our life for? Now, if it's only a matter of acquisition of things, then obviously one of the first things one wants to acquire is comfort. It means one exerts oneself less. But it's actually in exerting oneself, not necessarily physically, of course, though that comes into it, but exerting oneself morally, intellectually, and physically, that one becomes more alive. And it's in service to values. If we don't have those values, there is no direction that will call to us. And I do think that, I think this is, you can say I'm wrong, but I think that the values that have been highlighted all through the history of the West, from Plato onwards through Christianity and up to very recently, of goodness, beauty, and truth, and of the sacred. These are things that are not invented by us in order to cheer ourselves up. They're not sort of, well, you must have some values to live for, or what would you do? I believe in a much more important idea, which is that they are aspects of the ground of being. Whatever that ground of being is, it's the sort of ontological primitive behind which you cannot go. And aspects of it are goodness, beauty, and truth, as well as obviously its being divine and sacred. And if I'm right that the whole business of creation, of being a cosmos, of being anything at all, and especially life, it's that it can unfold these, make that ground of being more aware of, bring into fruition more and more and more of what it has in potentia to make it in existence. And to do that is our job. We have a role here. We're not roleless. We can go out of this world having done nothing if we wish. But if we feel we haven't done anything, we can start tonight, or today, I should say, by beginning to think about orientating our lives towards ways in which we can be more in touch with those values and help further them, help bring them more into being around us in small ways, because there is no large and small when you come to these things. Large and small doesn't apply to them. I mean, I sometimes say when a lover says, my love is as wide as the skies and as deep as the ocean, quite how wide and deep is that? I mean, what is in the realm of the psyche doesn't know these things. So when we say to ourselves in this slightly despondent way, but what can I do and what do I matter in this vast universe and so on? Well, first of all, the universe has to be about as big as it is from a physics point of view for there to be planets at all that can sustain life. So don't get worried about that one. But the fact is, it doesn't really matter about that. It's not the cosmos out there that can be measured by astronomy. It's the cosmos that is deep in here. And it's by going into that world, which is an infinite world, just as we might consider the physical cosmos infinite, that we find the things that draw us onwards and that give our lives purpose and meaning. Not giving them meaning by, as I say, making up something we can call the meaning. I can't tell you in words what that meaning is, but I know there is meaning. Much as if you were to ask me, what is the meaning of the person? My so-and-so, my friend, my lover, my partner means so much to me. And somebody says, well, what does she mean? Well, I can't tell you what she means. The meaning is palpable, but it's in here. Now, that's what we need to get towards, is seeing that the answers to these questions lie in here. And therefore they begin with each one of us today. We are not powerless. And we have effects on the world by the way we look at it and the way we attend to it. I call attention a moral act. I've said it so many times. But it's moral not only because it affects the sort of person we are, but it actually affects the world as well. It changes in a small way what there is there to be found. We see things, and that seeing is communicated and actually alters, it's responded to, even in the absence of other human beings, I believe, but in the presence of other human beings manifestly. And so this is how we effect change. We also need, of course, at the level of the previous conversation about nuclear power and so on, to attend with our left hemispheres to which are the least damaging ways to try and go forward with our civilization, and what do we need to do to stop people destroying things, to stop people destroying the habitat and ways of life of indigenous peoples and poisoning the seas and cutting down the forests. Of course we need to do that, but I sometimes say it would all be as nothing if we didn't change in here, because we'd still be the same dissatisfied, entitled, wretched, greedy human beings that we've sadly seemed to have become. We thought we were so much cleverer than our ancestors, who thought that it was actually really important to do things we now despise, like sort of have a religious life and have a moral compass in one's life and so forth. Anyway, there we are. I've said enough. Far too much already, actually.
Well, you've said things that are bringing tears to some of the groups, so I think they were well said nonetheless.
Well.
Okay, so I mean, there are a number of questions we're not going to get time for. One that's been very present in the group over recent weeks as we've been surveying matters has been grief. And David Brownstein was asking about whether you'd have anything to say about, before we look for what do we do and how do we make it better, like how important it is to understand and be aware of what we've lost, and to grieve it not as individuals necessarily, but in community. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Iain.
I do, indeed. And I think that we live in a culture which pathologizes grief. There is nothing wrong with grief. Grief is natural and important, and is an expression of value. And if we didn't feel grief at the loss of something, that would be a kind of devaluing of both what we've lost and of ourselves. On the other hand, there is such a thing as being limited by grief, by being frozen by grief, and fixed, and that is obviously something to be avoided. But I think that all of us who are in touch at all with the living world, which is suffering so much at the moment, are bound to feel grief. I think we're all commonly grieving. I think the question then is acknowledging it and not rushing it, but also being able to do that thing I was talking about, standing back just a little. It might be a rather Buddhist idea, because their idea of detachment is certainly not of being sort of clinically remote, but one of being able to see something for what it is and then let it go. And it's this business of letting go that I find so useful, and notice it a lot, at least in my life, increasingly, that I find it so easy to let go of things, because I tell myself, which is manifestly true, that nothing is forever. Everything is only for a while. And it's such a waste of time worrying about whether we can keep it forever or whatever. No, do everything you can to nourish it while it lasts. And once it goes, after a period of appropriate grief, let it go. So that doesn't mean to let go the importance of the world, but to let go our grief about it and begin to think, while we're still here, let us enhance the beauty of it. We all can. Let us respond to it truthfully. Let us not, put our names to what we know is wrong and what we know is a lie. If we were more alive to these things, I think the world would be a better place.
Yeah. I'll just share one thing that came up in conversation the other day. I've always held that idea that nothing lasts forever, all things move towards their end. And it was pointed out to me that the Stoics said nothing is so secure as our past. And I really liked the idea that my fiance died very suddenly some years back, and I rather like the idea that there is something that lasts forever, which is our past, and that if I'm grounded in that in a beautiful way, that is actually not something I'm holding on to in contrast to the reality of things, but somehow
that is exactly
real.
That's lovely. I'm glad you can feel it like that. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, nothing can take the past away. So the fact that you had, the way I look, I've had a very, very important loss for me too. But the way I look at it is, but I had something very, very special that maybe not so many people ever have. So I'm just profoundly lucky. It depends how you look at things. And also, when you have something really deep, who knows where it is and how it lasts and what it has done by just being in the cosmos. Has it been completely destroyed by history? I think not. Of course, whatever the particulars are have gone away, but some essence of what the cosmos can bring forth was particular and was real and has been taken back into the stream. I usually use this image when trying to help people understand it of a whirlpool in the stream, that we're each like whirlpools in a stream. And while we're there, while the whirlpool is there, it's real. It can be photographed. It has power to move stones. It's definitely real, but it's not in the water. It just is the water at the time that it's there. And when it moves on, the water has moved on, but gone, to something else. But the history of the whirlpool has shaped the stream and is also part of what makes the stream be what it is. So, that's a different way of thinking. I don't fear death in the slightest. I mean, basically, I to be slightly flippant, I mean, if there's nothing, I won't be disappointed. And this is something I'll be really interested to know what it is. But not being flippant, I mean, there's nothing, nothing to fear in the fact that it's been for a time and it's been something remarkable. It's been often very painful, and I wouldn't wish any part of it away.
Beautifully said. And we're virtually at time, Iain, so I don't know if there's anything that comes to mind for you that you want to part with or leave us on, or that's very present for you right now. But I want to let you go on time. So.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, if there's something urgent, I see that the gentleman whose name I didn't get, but I called him Chiaroscuro Man, has had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah, there are a few questions. Bob wanted to ask about education, Cassidy about Silicon Valley, Frank about anarchism. There's always more, but yes, if you're happy to take another question, then let's take Bob.
I mean, I don't know. I'll take one more question, and because I don't think I need to go precisely on time, but we ought to try and stick to it roughly. Yeah.
Given that you were so struck by his appearance at the outset, let's give him the final word. So Bob, over to you.
It's really wonderful that you could join us all. A number of us in our group have been pondering what is our obligation to educating the young? And so I'm very interested in your thoughts about education. If you could redesign our education system, do you have some thoughts and ideas about what you would suggest that would be helpful to our group?
I'll try and be very brief. The first would be for governments and bureaucracies to get largely out of the way, to appoint talented teachers who love what they do and let them get on with it. Obviously, there needs to be some degree of supervision and whatever it's called, accountability, I understand that. But nonetheless, it should be a very light hand on the tiller. At the moment, good teachers are hobbled by all kinds of rules, procedures, box ticking, and utter nonsense. And there cannot be a vital relationship between the teacher and the pupil. That's what education is. It's like everything else. It's a relationship. It's not the insertion of something into another being. It's a relation. That's how I learned everything, from the feeling that a fellow being who knew more than me was in my presence and was giving something to me. And I felt that was how everything I know is in some sense been rather like learning ballet or tai chi. Ridiculous enough when you look at this old man, but it's modelled on an example that I've seen somebody do it, and I learned to do it. I don't do it by going move your finger here and so on. Education isn't like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the curriculum. It's been an absolute disaster prioritizing only STEM subjects. There's nothing wrong with them, of course, but they're not in themselves an education. They can't be. And we're producing people who are simply not educated. They need to be educated to know something of the history of their culture, not as pure politics and Yabu Sachs and all that sort of thing, but actually learning something about the past, learning about philosophy, learning how to see questions from two sides, not just from one, learning literature, enjoying poetry, learning about music, learning to dance, learning to do theatre, learning other languages. These are the things that bring us to life. It's very important to be able to do technical things with AI, I'm sure, but it doesn't substitute for a second for all those really key things. If we don't get them back into the mainstream, we're fundamentally letting down a whole vast generation, and make them harder in their turn when they're bringing up their own children. And we're really signing the death warrant of our own civilization. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Iain. I think you haven't seen all the immense gratitude for both your time with us tonight and for your work in general in the chat. So I'm channeling it to you now.
Well, thank you all very much for allowing me to come and talk to you.
It's been a joy, and I have a few admin things to do with the group, but if you want to sign off now, by all means, do so.
I'll sign off. Yes, thank you. I mean, if there's a chat that can be saved, save it, because I always like to look at what people thought. That's very nice. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great.
If it can't be saved, don't worry.
I'll put it will, and I'll forward it on to you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye then.
Good night, Iain. So yes, by all means, if you want to share stuff in the chat now, I will make sure that it reaches Iain. Also, slightly in contradiction to that, I'll put in the chat the schedule, just for those who I know value me sharing it at this point. So here it is, and as I've mentioned before, we have our reflection sessions this week are kind of split. There's one on Thursday and there's one on Saturday. Because we have our monthly gathering on Friday, which is a year-round thing. Also wanted to highlight Matty's Trees and Thee conversation, which will be happening on Friday at 10 AM Eastern. And I see that that's been rather popular in the forum, so I suspect it will be well attended. And then, of course, there's the eco gatherings, alumni-hosted sessions, etc., happening as usual, and our 24 Zoom room now. And Anne, it looks like you wanted to say something.
I just wondered what's going on with the McGilchrist irregulars.
Oh, wow. Would someone like to speak to that? David?
We have stopped meeting regularly. There is a sort of residual group, but the principals, me and Bertus and Jeff, we reached a point where the words stopped being important, and I think Bertus can speak to that. When you get the message, hang up the phone. And we dwell day to day in the intelligence and value of McGilchrist's work, but the endless discussions, the weekly parsing has come to an end. I'd be thrilled to talk about McGilchrist with anyone who wants to talk about it, though, his work. So please please be in touch with me if you'd like to continue, or Bertus or Jeff or anyone, I think.
Maybe occasionally. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And yeah, obviously, if anyone does want to talk more about Iain's work, then you need to do so now in the 24/7 Zoom room, or organise set a time to talk with anyone else who would wish to, as with any other topic. So Bob meanwhile is getting some food in, it seems. I'm not quite feeling the call of any particular song right now, so I'm not going to close this with a song, and I will see many of you, well, in the coming days. Whenever I always do this, I share the schedule and then forget what I've just said and when the next session is, but whenever it is, I'll be there and hopefully see some of you in there. And thank you, everyone. Bye for now.